For as long as humans have sailed across the vast and unpredictable oceans, there have a waving story whispered among sailors, passed down through generations, and carried across continents by those who dared to travel beyond the safety of land. These stories were not always about storm or navigation, but about something far more unsettling, something that could not be easily explained. Out there, beyond the horizon, where the sea met the sky, sailors often felt that they were not alone. There were moments when the water would grow strangely still, and that the ocean itself were holding its breath. At other times, the surface would shift in a way that seemed unnatural. That showed something enormous was moving just beneath it. Shadows would appear without form, and the deeper the water became, the stronger the feeling that something unseen was watching from below. Among all of these stories, one name had endured for centuries, the Kraken. This was not described as just another sea creature, nor as something that could be easily understood. Instead, it was something far greater, something that exists on the edge between reality and imagination. Sailors spoke of a presence so vast that it could be mistaken for land itself. Some claim that what appeared to be the small island in the distance would slowly begin to move, revealing that it would never land at all, but living a thing rising from the depth. To those who spent their life at sea, the Kraken was more than just a legend. It was a possibility, a reminder that the ocean was not fully known and perhaps never would be. In a time where maps were incomplete and much of the world remained unexplored, the unknown was not abstract idea. It was something very real, something that could appear without warming. As ships traveled farther from shore and into deeper water, encounters became harder to explain. There were reports of vessels being pulled downward by sudden current as if something beneath them had taken hold. There were accounts of long, massive ships emerging briefly before disappearing again into darkness, and there was story of entire crew who vanished, leaving behind nothing but unanswered questions. Of course, not all these stories can be taken at face value. Fear has a way of shaping perfect perception, especially in environments as vast and unpredictable as the ocean. In the absence of knowledge, human mind often fills the gap with imagination. A large wave can become something alive, a shadow can become creature, and an unfamiliar animal can transform into something legendary. Yet history has shown us something important. There have been many creatures that were once dismissed as myths, only to be proven real much later. For centuries, the idea of giant squid was treated as nothing more than fantasy. Sailor described them in vivid detail, but without physical evidence. These stories were largely ignored. It was not until relatively recently that science confirmed their existence, revealing animals far larger and more mysterious than anyone has expected. This raised a reason that's difficult to ignore. If something as extraordinary as a giant squid could remain hidden for so long, then what else might still exist in the depth of ocean? Even today, the deep sea remains one of the least explored regions on Earth. Vast areas lie in a complete darkness, under immense pressure, in conditions that are difficult for humans to even imagine. These environments are home to creatures that have evolved in isolation, adapting in ways that seem almost alien. In such a way, the word so little is known and so much remains unseen. It is not unreasonable to wonder whether legend like Kraken might have some basis in reality. Perhaps not in the exact form described in ancient story, but as something inspired by real encounters with creatures that science had only begun to understand. Or perhaps something even larger still exists, hidden far below, beyond the reach of our current technology. The ocean does not reveal its secret easily, never has. And until we are able to fully explore its depth, There will always be room for mystery. Always have space where legend and reality overlap, where story refuse to be, and where questions remain unanswered. So the story of Kraken is not just about the monster of the past, it is about the unknown and the possibility that, even though there are things in this world that we have yet to discover. 1. Backgrounds and origins. To understand where the idea of Kraken come from, it is necessary to go back to the time when the ocean was far less understood than it is today. For early settlers, the sea was not just a road for travel or trade, but a vast and unpredictable environment filled with uncertainty. Maps were incomplete, navigation was limited, and much of the world beyond the coastline remained unknown. In such conditions, even the smallest anomaly could take on a much greater meaning. It was within this context that the earliest story of Kraken began to emerge, particularly in the cold water of northern Europe, in regions such as Norway and Iceland, where the sea played a central role in daily life. Fishermen and sailors spent long periods of time navigating deep and often dangerous water. These were not casual journeys. They were essential for survival, which means that those who traveled this road became highly familiar with the behavior of the ocean. And yet, despite this familiarity, there was still a moment that could not be easily explained. Over time, these moments began to take shape in the form of story, not exaggerated tales meant purely for entertainment, but accounts that reflect general attempt to describe something unusual. Sailors spoke of massive forms beneath the water, of areas where the sea behaved in ways that seemed unnatural, and of encounters that left a lasting impression even on those who had spent their entire life at sea. One of the earliest detailed descriptions of the Kraken comes from the 18th century, when a Norwegian bishop named Eric Pontoppidan documented maritime account in his writing. He described a creature so large that when it surfaced, it could be mistaken for a small island. According to this report, its presence was not always immediately obvious. At times, sailors would believe that they had found a safe place to anchor, only to realize too late that the ground beneath them would not sell it at all. What made this account particularly interesting in the way that it reflects the perspective of time. Without modern scientific knowledge, people rely heavily on observation and interpretation. When faced with something unfamiliar, they describe it using comparison to what they already knew. In this case, an island became the closest reference point of something that appeared large, stationary, and part of the landscape. However, the story did not end with sight alone. In many of these early accounts, the Kraken was not simply passive present, as what describes as something capable of influencing the water around it. Sailors spoke to certain changes in the sea, including powerful currents and whirlpools that seemed to appear without warning. These phenomena were often attributed to the movement of a massive creature beneath the surface, something so large that its action could affect the ocean itself. Whether these observations were entirely accurate, it is difficult to determine. Natural ocean processes, such as underwater current or geological activity, can sometimes produce similar effects. But for those who experience them without the benefit of modern explanation, it was only natural to connect these events to something alive. As these stories spread, they began to take on a more defined form. The kraken was no longer just a vague presence beneath the water, but a specific, entirely recognizable characteristic. It became part of maritime culture, passed from one generation to the next. Each retelling adding new details while resolving the core idea of something vast and hidden beneath the sea. Interestingly, the concept of a giant sea creature is not limited to Scandinavian tradition. Similar ideas appear in many different cultures around the world, suggesting that the human experience of the ocean often lead to comparable interpretations. While the names of specific description may vary, the underlying theme remain consistent. The belief that the depths of the ocean are home for something powerful and largely unknown. This consistency raises an important point. When different group of people, separated by geography and culture, develop similar story, it often reflects a shared experience rather than pure coincidence. In the case of Kraken, that shared experience may have been the encounter with something unfamiliar in an environment that was already difficult to understand. At the same time, it is important to recognize how the story evolved over time. As they were told and retold, they became shaped not only by observation but also by imagination. Details may have been added, certain elements emphasized, and others simplified, gradually transforming a possible real encounter into something more legendary. And yet, even with these changes, the core idea remains remarkably stable. A massive presence beneath the ocean. Something rarely seen but often felt. Something that exists but beyond the limit of what we can fully understand. In this way, the origin of Kraken is not tied to a single moment or a single story, but to a long story of human interaction with the sea. It is a product of observation, interpretation, and a natural tendency to seek an explanation for the unknown. Whether it began a real encounter, a series of misunderstood events, or a combination of both, the story of Kraken has endured centuries, continuing to capture the imagination of those who look out across the ocean and wonder what might still lie beneath its surface. To the story unfold. As the story of Kraken continued to develop over time, people began to describe it with increasing detail, as if trying to give form to something that was otherwise impossible to fully understand. This description did not always match perfectly, but they share enough similarities to suggest that they were shaped by a common idea, one that had taken root in the mind of those who had spent long periods of time at sea. What stood out most in this account was the sheer scale of creature. It was not described as a similar large, but as something far beyond the size of any known animal. Some accounts suggest that its body could stretch for an incredible distance beneath the water, so vast that only a small portion of it would ever be visible at the surface. To those who witnessed it, the kraken did not appear as a single, clearly defined shape, but rather as a present, something that seemed to occupy a significant part of surrounding sea. Its form was often compared to what that a giant squid or octopus, with long, flexible limbs extending outward in multiple directions. These limbs, or tentacles, were described as thick and powerful, capable of moving with a slow, deliberate motion that made them appear almost effortless in the strength. In some story, they would rise above the surface of the water, reaching into the air before restopping again, leaving behind only ripples and a lingering sense of unease. These were also a sense that creature did not need to be fully visible to make it present known. In fact, many descriptions focus less on what was seen and more on what was felt. The water around it was said to be behave differently, also influenced by something beneath it. Movement became less predictable, currents shifted in unusual way, and the surface itself seemed to be respond to something hidden below. Some accounts describe the Kraken as having a body that blended into the darkness of the ocean, making it difficult to distinguish from the surrounding water. This idea concealment added to the sense that the creator belonged to a part of the world that humans were not meant to be observed. directly. It was not something that reveals so easily, but rather something that exists just out of reach, appearing only briefly before returning to the depth. The eyes of the Kraken, what mentioned, were often described as large and reflective, capable of catching what little light exists at the surface. This detail, whether imagined or based on real observation, contribute to the impression that creature was aware of its surrounding in a way that felt more intentional, not aggressive in direct sense, but observant, as if it were simply part of much larger system within the ocean. There were also description of the environment around the creature changing softly. The all might feel heavier, the sound seemed quieter, and as though everything had shifted into a different state. These sensory details are difficult to verify, but they will appear frequently enough in various accounts to suggest that they were an important part of how people experience these encounters. Another recurring detail is the idea that Kraken did not move quickly. Instead, it's what often described as slow and deliberate, a sign making rapid movement unnecessary. This slow movement may have contributed to the impression that it were part of ocean itself, rather than something separate from it. It did not chase or pursue in the way smaller creature might, but simply exist. Its presence alone enough to influence everything around it. In some interpretation, the Kraken was even thought to remain in one place for extended periods of time, resting deep below the surface, only rising occasionally. This idea maybe contribute to the story of sailor mistaking of land, especially in conditions where visibility was limited and the line between sea and sky became difficult to distinguish. What is particularly interesting about this description is how they combine both clarity and uncertainty. Certain features, such as the tentacle in the immense line, appear consistently, while other aspects remain vague or open interpretation. This combination gives the impression that people were trying to describe something real but lacked the means to fully capture it in the precise term. From the modern perspective, many of these characteristics can be linked to no deep-sea creature, particularly large cephalopods like squid. However, the scale described in this story often goes far beyond what has been scientifically confirmed. This gap between description and evidence is where the mystery continues to exist. Also, the consistency of certain elements suggests that these descriptions were not entirely random. They were shaped by repeated experience, observation, and being difficult to explain what were memorable enough to be shared and preserved over time. In this way, the detailed image of Kraken becomes less about single, clearly defined creature and more about an accumulation of impression. It is a representation of something that exists at the edge of understanding, where observation and imagination begin to overlap. And perhaps that is what makes the description so compelling, not the certainty of what the Kraken is, but the way it reflects the limit of what people were able to see and the effort to describe something that did not easily fit into the known world. Even today, when we have more knowledge and better tools, the deep ocean continues to challenge our understanding. New discovery regularly reshape what we think is possible, reminding us that the boundary between the known and unknown is not fixed, but constantly shifting. Within the shifting boundary, the image of Kraken still had a place, not as a confirmed reality, but a possibility that continued to invite curiosity. 3. Ancient records and legend. As the image of Kraken became more defined through repeated description, it gradually moved beyond individual encounter and entered a realm of recorded history and shared cultural memory. What began as scattered a crowd from sailors slowly found its way into writing texts, maps, and stories that were passed down across generations. In this process, the Kraken was no longer just something experienced on the sea, but something acknowledged, discussed, and preserved in a more lasting form. One of the most notable early references comes from Northern Europe, where maritime life was deeply connected to survival. In this region, the ocean was not only a source of food and travel, but also a place of uncertainty. Because of this, any unusual event was taken seriously, and stories were often recorded with the intention of informing others rather than simply entertaining them. Writers and scholars of the time collected these accounts, attempting to document what sailors had witnessed. While they did not always fully understand what they were describing, they recognized that these reports follow certain patterns. The idea of massive presence beneath the sea, something capable of affecting the world itself, appear often enough to be considered more than a single isolated story. As these records spread, they began to influence how people understood the ocean. Maps from early century sometimes include illustration of large sea creature in unexplored area, not necessarily as confirmed fact, but as warning. These images reflect a combination of observation and uncertainty, suggesting that beyond no roads, these were still forces that had yet to be understood. At the same time, similar themes were emerging in other parts of the world. In ancient Greek tradition, there were stories of sea-dwelling beings that could threaten ships passing through narrow water. This story often focused on the idea of something hidden, something that remained out of sight but until the moment it revealed itself. While the details differ, the underlying concept shared the resemblance to the idea of Kraken, a powerful presence that in ocean that exists beyond ordinary experience. In other cultures, particularly in regions with strong maritime tradition, there was an account of enormous creatures living beneath a wave. Some were described in similar terms, representing an unpredictability of nature, while others were presented more directly, as if based on actual encounters. Despite the difference of in language and interpretation, the repetition of these ideas across different cultures suggests that they may have been shaped by similar experience. This pattern raised an important questions about the relationship between myth and observation. Why it is easy to assume that such stories were purely imaginative, this consistency found across different regions indicate that they may have been influenced by real events, even if those events were not fully understood over time. As stories are passed from one generation to the next, they naturally change. Details are added, certain elements are emphasized, and others may be forgotten. Over time, this process can transform a simple account into something far more complex. However, the core of the story often remains intact, especially when it tied to a shared experience. In the case of Kraken, that core idea, the existence of something vast and hidden beyond the ocean, has remained remarkably consistent. Even as the story evolved, this central concept continued to appear, suggesting that it had a certain level of importance for those who tell it. It is so worth noting that early records did not always attempt to separate fact from the interpretation in the way modern science does. Observation will often record alongside belief, and the line between the two was not always clearly defined. This does not necessarily reduce the value, but it does mean that they need to be understood within the context of time in which they were created. Rather than dismissing Greek record entirely, this may be more useful to view them as a reflection of how people interpret the environment. They provide insight into the way that ocean was experienced, not just as a physical space, but as something inspired both curiosity and caution. Over time, as navigation improved, scientific understanding developed, some of these earlier beliefs were reconsidered. Certain elements of the story you explain through natural phenomena, while other remains uncertain. Yet even with this advancement, the deeper part of the ocean continued to resist full exploration, leaving room of the possibility that not everything that had been discovered. In this way, the Kraken exists not only a legend, but as part of a larger pattern in human history. It represents the effort to describe something that lies beyond immediate understanding, something that cannot be easily categorized or explained. Where the ancient record describe a real creature, a series of misunderstood events, or combination of both, they continue to hold a certain significance. They remind us that our knowledge of the world has always been incomplete, and that's what we consider impossible today may one day be understood differently. And perhaps that's why these stories have endured for so long. Not because they provide clear answers, but because they continue to raise questions. Question about what was seen, but what believed, and what might still remain hidden beneath the surface of the ocean, waiting to be discovered. 4. Sailor Encounters. As this story became more widely known and gradually found their place in written records, they were continuously reinforced by new accounts from those who spent their life at sea. Sailor, fisherman, and explorer would return from the journey with experience that did not always fit within ordinary expectations. While many of these encounters could be explained in simple terms, others remain difficult to understand even after careful consideration. Like a sea as a way require deep awareness of environment. Those who travel across open water learn to recognize patterns in the wind, movement of waves, and the behavior of marine life. This familiarity allows them to distinguish between what is normal and what is not. Because of this, when sailors describe something unusual, it often carries a certain weight. Their observations were not made lightly, nor were they easily dismissed by others who share similar experience. Among the many accounts that have been recorded over time, there are recurring descriptions of movement when the ocean seemed to change in subtle but noticeable ways. The surface of water would become unusually calm, as though the natural rhythm of the sea has been interrupted. In other cases, the opposite would occur, with the water moving in a way that felt disorder, lacking the predictable pattern the sailor has come to rely on. These changes were sometimes accompanied by the appearance of shape beneath the surface, not clearly defined, but large enough to be recognized as something distinct from the surrounding water. Sailors would describe shadow moving slowly below their vessel, maintaining a distance yet remaining present long enough to create a lasting impression. In certain accounts, long, curved form was said to be imperceptibly above the water before disappearing again. This movement was not always dramatic, and in many cases they were observed only for a short moment. However, even the brief glimpse was enough to bring question, especially when the size and form did not match any known creature. There are also reports of ships encountering sudden and powerful disturbance in the water, occurring without any obvious cause. Current would shift unexpectedly, and the movement of the sea would become difficult to predict. Although experiencing at the same time, these even felt as though were being influenced by something beneath the surface, something large enough to affect the surrounding environment. In earlier centuries, where knowledge of oceanic processes was limited, such events were often interpreted as sign of hidden presence. The idea that massive creature could be responsible for these disturbance became a way of making sense of experience that otherwise lacked explanation. Even in more recent times, as navigation and scientific understanding have improved, reports of unusual encounters have not disappeared entirely. Modern fishermen occasionally describe moments where the behavior of the water seemed inconsistent with now pattern. Instrument may detect movement below, but without a clear visual confirmation, the exact nature of what lies beneath remains uncertain. It is important to consider the condition under which maybe of these encounters occur. The open ocean can be environment of limited visibility, especially at night or in poor weather. Fatigue, isolation, and even the vastness of the surrounding can influence perception. Under such circumstances, even familiar object can be appear unfamiliar, and ordinary event can take on different significance. However, not all account can be easily attributed to misinterpretation. The consistency of certain elements, particularly the sense of scale and the presence of something moving beneath the surface, suggests that there may be a basis in real observation, even if the details were not always precise. Encounter with large marine animals, such as whale or giant squid, may have a contributed to this experience. When seen under unusual conditions, these creatures can appear very different from how they are typically understood. Their movement, sign, and behavior may seem unfamiliar, especially to those who are not expecting to see them. At the same time, it is possible that some encounter involve phenomena that are still not fully understood. The ocean is a dynamic system with complex interaction between currents, temperature, and underwater geography. This factor can produce effects that are difficult to predict and even more difficult to interpret with a detailed knowledge. What makes Sally encounter particularly compelling is the way that they exist between certainty and uncertainty. They are grounded in real experience, yet often lack enough detail to be fully explained. This creates a space where interpretation becomes necessary, and where different explanations can coexist. For those who experience this movement firsthand, the impact was often lasting. Even if they could not fully describe what they had seen, the memory remained, influencing how they view the ocean and the story they choose to share with others. Over time, this individual experience became part of a larger narrative, contributing to the ongoing story of Kraken. Each account, whether clear or uncertain, added another layer to the idea that something hidden beneath the surface, something that could not be easily observed but could be still be felt. In this way, cellular encounters do not provide definitive proof of the Kraken existence, but they do offer insight into how such a story could develop and persist. They reflect the human effort to understand an environment that is vast, complex, and not yet fully explored. And even now, despite advances in technology and exploration, the ocean continues to produce movement that challenge our expectation movement moment that remind us that there are still aspects of this world that remain beyond our complete understanding. And in those moments, the possibility of something unknown feels just a little more real. Five scientific perspective. As this story and encounter continue to raise questions, it's become natural to look to a science for possible explanation. Unlike earlier periods in history, modern research allows us to observe and study the ocean in ways that really were all once impossible. With advanced technology, deep sea exploration, and improved methods of analysis, scientists have been able to uncover details about marine life that were previously unknown. One of the most important developments in this area has been discovery and study of large deep sea creatures, particularly those that resembled the description of often associated with Kraken. Among these, giant squid stand out as one of the most relevant examples. For a long time, they were considered little more than stories similar to legend told by sailors. Reports of enormous tentacle creatures were often dismissed due to lack of direct evidence. However, as research progressed, physical specimens began to appear. Giant squid were eventually confirmed to be real, with some individuals reaching impressive size and living in deep ocean environment where human observation is extremely limited. The fact that such creatures could remain largely unseen for so long highlights just how little was known about the deep sea, even in relatively recent history. In addition to giant squid, scientists have sought identifying other large cephalopods, including species that inhabit even deeper regions of the ocean. These animals haven't adapted to extreme conditions, developing features that allow them to survive in darkness, under immense pressure, developing and with limited access to foods. The body, movement, and behavior can appear unusual when compared to more familiar marine life, which may have explained why early encounters were interpreted in more dramatic ways. The concept of deep sea gigantism also play a role in understanding how such creatures might develop in certain environments. Particularly those found in the depth of the ocean, some species tend to grow larger than their relatives in shallower water. While the exact reasons for this are still being studied, it suggests that the deep sea has potential to support organisms of considerable size. Even with this discovery, there are still limits to what science can currently explain. The ocean is vast, and a significant portion of it remains unexplored. Many deep sea environments are difficult to access due to extreme conditions, and as a result, our understanding of this reason is still incomplete. New species are discovered on a regular basis, often in places that were previously thought to be well studied. This ongoing process of discovery indicates that the boundaries of what it knows are constantly changing. What may seem unlikely at one point in time can later become accepted as a new evidence emerge. This story of marine biology includes several examples of its pattern, where, where ideas one considers speculative were eventually supported by observation and research. At the same time, science also provides alternative explanation for some of the phenomena described in earlier accounts. Ocean currents, underwater geological activity, and natural variations in water movement can create effects that may appear unusual to those who are not familiar with them. Sudden changes in the behavior of the sea, including the formation of whirlpools or unexpected shift in currents, can often be explained through these natural processes. Visual perception can also play a role. In low tide conditions or when viewing objects through moving water, shape and distance can be difficult to judge accurately. A no animal seen under unfamiliar conditions may appear much larger or different than it actually is. This can contribute to the development of interpretations that do not really match the original observation. Despite this explanation, this remains a degree of uncertainty that cannot be completely eliminated. The deep sea continues to present challenge for researchers, and not all questions have a clear answer. While science have made significant progress, it had not reached a point where every aspect of the ocean is fully understood. This balance between explanation and uncertainty is what makes the topic particularly interesting. On one hand, there are logical and evidence-based interpretations that account for many the detail found in historical account. On the one hand, there is still enough that remain unknown to leave from the further exploration and possibility. Rather than providing a definitive conclusion, the scientific perspective offers a framework for understanding how such story could arise. It allows us to connect historical description with real-world phenomena, while also acknowledging the limitation of current knowledge. In this way, the idea of Kraken can be viewed not as a direct contradiction to science, but as a part of an ongoing process of discovery. It reflects the gap between what had been observed and what had been fully explained, a gap that continued to narrow over time, but had not yet disappeared entirely. And as long as the gap exists, there will always be space for question. Question about what had already been discovered, what remained hidden, and what might still be waiting in the depth of ocean beyond the reach of what we currently know. Sick theories and controversy. As scientific understanding continued to expand, the story of Kraken did not simply disappear. Instead, it moved into a different space where explanation and uncertainty exist side by side. While many aspects of the legend can be connected to no marine life in natural ocean possessed, there are still elements that remain open to interpretation, giving rise to a range of different theories. One of the most widely accepted ideas is that the kraken is not a single specific creature, but rather that a combination of observations that were gradually shaped into unfinished story. Encounter with large animal. Over time, these interpretations became more consistent, eventually forming the image that been passed down through history. From this perspective, the kraken can be seen as a reflection of how humans respond to unknown. That is, when faced with something that cannot be easily explained, there is a natural tendency to organize that what experience into narrative. This process does not necessarily create something entirely fictional, but it can amplify certain detail while simplifying other, resulting in a story that feels both real and extraordinary at the same time. Another theory focused more directly on possibility of undiscovered theories. The deep ocean remains one of the least explored environments on Earth. A new form of life continues to be identified in regions that were previously inaccessible. Some researchers suggest that it's not possible for larger, less frequently observed organisms to exist in this depth, especially given the vast size of ocean and limited scope of current exploration. This idea does not require Kraken to exist exactly as described in historical account, but it leaves open the possibility that similar creature, perhaps smaller or less dramatic in form, could have inspired those stories. In this way, the legend become connected to real biological process, even if the original description were influenced by limited information and challenging conditions. There are also interpretations that focus on environmental and geological factors. Certain areas of the ocean are known for unusual activity, including strong current, certain changes in water movement, and the presence of what underwater formation that can affect the behavior of the surface. In earlier time, without a detailed understanding of this process, such phenomena could easily be attributed to something alive, particularly if they occur alongside other unusual observations. At the same time, it is important to consider how story evolve as they shape. Each retelling introduced the possibility of change, whether through memory emphasis or the desire to make the account more engaging. Over long periods of time, this small change can accumulate, gradually transforming an original experience into something more complex and more difficult to trace back into single source. Despite this more grounded explanation, the idea of Kraken continued to invite speculation beyond what can be directly supported by evidence. For some, the persistence of similar story across different cultures suggests that there may be aspects of the ocean that remain entirely unknown. Other view of legend as a reminder that scientific knowledge, where extensive, is still incomplete, particularly when it comes to environments that are difficult to access. What makes this topic especially interesting is not the presence of a single correct answer, but the range of possibility that exists within it. Each theory offers a different way of understanding the same set of observation, highlighting the complexity of interpreting experience that occur in unfamiliar and often extreme conditions. In this context, the discussion becomes less about proving or disproving the existence of specific creature and more about exploring the relationship between observation, interpretation, and knowledge. It reflects the way humans attempt to make sense of the world, especially when faced with environments that do not easily reveal their structure or behavior. The controversy surrounding the Kraken, therefore, is not rooted in disagreement alone, but in the broader question of how much we truly know about the natural world. While some explanations were well supported, other remains one open-ended, shaped by the limit of current research and ongoing process of discovery. As new technology allow for deeper exploration of the ocean, it is possible that some of these questions will be answered more clearly. At the same time, each new discovery often leads to additional questions, expanding rather than reducing the sense of mystery. And it is within the balance between what have been explained and what have yet to be understood that the story of Kraken continue to exist, not as a fixed idea, but as an evolving one. A reminder that even in the world where so much has been explored, there are still places where uncertainty remains, and where the boundary between knowledge and possibility is not always easy to define. As the story of Kraken reached its end, what remains is not a clear answer, but a quiet sense of possibility. Over time, science had helped explain many of the mysteries that once seemed impossible. In the ocean, while still vast and complex, is no longer as unknown as it once was. Yet even with all that has been discovered, there is still a great deal that lies beyond our understanding. The deep sea continued to exist as one of the last frontiers on Earth, a place where conditions were so extreme that exploration remained limited. Every new expedition revealed something unexpected, whether it's with a previously unknown species, an unusual form of behavior, or an environment that challenged our what we thought we understood. This discovery served as a reminder that knowledge is way incomplete, and that what seemed unlikely today may become accepted tomorrow. In this context, the Kraken do not need to be broken drilled in order to remain meaningful. Its significance lies in what it represents. It reflects a long story of human curiosity, a desire to understand the unknown, and an awareness that are still aspects of natural world that have yet to be fully explored. The story so bestseller, the record reserved in history, and the question raised by modern science all contribute to the larger picture. A picture that do not provide certainty, but instead invite reflection. It encouraged us to consider how much we learn while also recognizing how much remains to be discovered. Perhaps the Kraken was never a single creature, but rather a way of describing something that could not be easily explained, a symbol shaped by experience, observation, and imagination, existing at the point where knowledge began to fade into uncertainty. Or perhaps in some form, is what inspired by something real. Something has existed or still exists far below the surface, hidden in a region that we have yet to be fully explored. The ocean did not reveal its secret all at once. It unfolds slowly, offering glimpses rather than complete answer. And in those glimpses, there is a way, a possibility of something more, something just beyond what we can currently see or understand. So, the question remains not as a problem to be solved, but as an idea to be considered. If there are still part of this world what we have not yet explored, if there are still creatures that have been to be discovered, then how certain can we be about what does or does not exist? Somewhere in the vast darkness beneath the ocean, there may be a form of life that have never encountered the surface, never been observed, and never been recorded. They exist outside of our awareness, moving through environment that remain largely untouched. Whether the Kraken belong to that hidden world or not may be never fully known. But the possibility alone is enough to keep the story alive. Because in the end, the ocean did not just play, it is a reminder. A reminder that there's still mystery left in the world, still question about without answer, still depth that have yet to be explored. And as long as those depths remain, the idea of something waiting within them will never truly disappear.